So, like I started getting into at the end of the last video, I want to emphasize that, again, schemas are not just this kind of random quirk of our thinking. They are a very adaptive, functional way of organizing and calling up information. Again, there's way too much in our environments for us to pay full attention to pretty much anything. So, schemas help us guide our attention by putting things into neat categories, calling up information in a purposeful, organized way, figure out what's going on in situations that we aren't quite sure about by using old experiences to help us figure things out, and it just makes our memories more accessible and easy to apply. But they can cause problems because, the example many of you are probably thinking about is, well, we talked about stereotypes as schemas, and stereotypes are, generally not purely true descriptions of people from different categories, right? They're generalizations, and categories are filled with individual people who don't always fit those generalizations, or maybe don't often fit those generalizations. So using schemas to judge things broadly, particularly judging people broadly, can cause big problems. In a broader sense, schemas can affect what we remember and what we see. They can distort them. You can misremember things based on a schema that you're trying to map a memory onto, because you might sort of invent things about an experience you had based on what you expected to happen, or based on what fits into your idea about what happened. So, to give you one example about how this works, something that you've probably heard before, but applied to this concept in psychology, a self-fulfilling prophecy is something that can really easily happen when we're applying schemas to our social interactions. So, if you have some sort of expectancy about a target, about a person, then the things that you observe that person doing are going to be seen through the lens of that schema, through the lens of those expectations. This is called perceptual confirmation, where you're seeing things in the way that you expect to see them, and you're interpreting things in a biased way that confirms your expectations. Then you're going to interact with that person in a way that's consistent with those expectations and the fact that they have been supported by what you're seeing. So this leads to this step we call behavioral confirmation. So you're acting toward a person in a way that fits with what you expected. They're responding in a way that's consistent with how you're treating them. So they're confirming your expectations about them. So to give you an example that might help, imagine you are meeting someone for the first time, maybe at a party, maybe in class or something, and you have an expectation based on something about your schema for how this conversation is going, that that person is interested in you romantically. So that person smiles at you, and you think, yep, they are into me. And obviously, that's not always the case. And you're interpreting that friendly, normal human gesture as confirming your expectations about romantic interest in this situation. Then you decide you're going to talk to that person, engage with them, approach them, treat them nicely, and they're going to then engage with you perhaps and continue to keep this cycle going. So this might show you, yep, they are treating me in a nice way, they must be interested, etc., etc. So this gets this whole cycle going that reinforces your initial expectation, even though maybe they're just being polite. It's hard to pull those things apart when you don't really know someone, right? But you can see how these things cycle together. Similar things, an example that comes to mind might be how we treat elderly people sometimes, that we have an expectation that they are not capable. So if they make a very understandable mistake or forget something like everyone does, we think, oh, yep, they're old and infirm and demented, and they can't remember things. So then we treat them in a way that's consistent with that. We don't give them opportunities to show us their intelligence or show us their competence. And so then they're not able to show us their competence. So we think, yep, they're old and infirm and like not capable of helping. And it's a spiral that, just confirms your expectations and pigeonholes people into a particular area. Another example of this from a really influential study from Mark Snyder and colleagues. Mark Snyder is actually at the University of Minnesota as of this recording. He is probably retiring relatively soon. He's been around for a while in this area, but he did a cool study looking at how this worked in some like first impression sorts of conversations that they did in the laboratory. So, capitalizing on our, unfortunate but pervasive stereotype in many cultures that people that are attractive have positive social characteristics and other types of characteristics, they randomly assign people to get photos of either an attractive or unattractive person that they were talking to on the phone. So there were male and female participants. The men saw a picture of either an attractive or an unattractive woman. They talked to a woman on the phone that was not actually the woman in either of those pictures, and had a conversation. And the picture that the man saw influenced not only how the conversation went for them, but how the women acted and how they experienced the conversation, as well as how other people rated the conversation. So it might have gone something like this. So you have these kind of two disconnects where you have a person who thinks they're talking to either an attractive or unattractive person, and they're interpreting the things that the woman on the other end is saying as confirming that expectation, that they're either a very friendly, engaging person if they saw the attractive photo, or that they're not very socially competent or something if they saw the unattractive photo. Then the way the men are treating the woman because of that perceptual confirmation sort of limits how the woman is going to be able to act in that situation. So that leads to behavioral confirmation, because if the man starts being, cold and distant because they think that the person they're talking to is not like worthy of their time or attention, then that's going to limit the types of expressions and interactions that the woman is going to be able to have. So the really interesting part of the study is that just from one person seeing a picture about the other person, it influences the entire conversation. It influences the person that sees it, it influences the person on the other end, and it influences the quality of the interaction that they're having overall by virtue of an observer watching that or listening to that phone call. So I think this is a really important lesson, that our expectations create the social reality that we live in. It's not just that our perceptions are reflections of a social reality. They are actively constructing that social reality when we are engaging with it. And it's because the schemas that we have, expectations about people, about situations, about circumstances, guide what we expect to see. They influence how we treat other people. And we only see the types of behaviors from others that we are, allowing, essentially, in a lot of situations with our sort of biased perceptions of what is going on. So again, it's not just that we are observing some objective thing about our social reality. The beliefs that we have when we go into a situation create that social reality, and they affect other people. So, and again, you might not agree, certainly, with the idea that attractive people have, more intelligence or competence or better social engagement skills than other people, because it isn't true. But there is a pervasive schema that is true, right? Same thing with different stereotypes. You may be very opposed to the negative stereotypes about many marginalized groups and minority groups, and you may know that those stereotypes are not true. However, you're still aware of a lot of that information, and it can still affect your processing and affect how you treat someone, or it can affect how others treat you, obviously. And we'll circle back to a lot of these ideas when we get to social psychology and talk a little bit more about prejudice and discrimination in that unit. Okay, shifting gears just slightly, I kind of foreshadowed this earlier, but I want to make a distinction again between, cognition has its content, the knowledge, the information, and it has its processes. And we've talked about some types of processes so far, but I want to bring up another one. And I, think it's useful to think quickly about the types of decisions you make in your moment-to-moment, day-to-day life, right? You make tons of decisions all the time, and a lot of times you might not be giving those decisions a ton of attention, right? Deciding what you're going to wear, maybe it depends on your motivation that morning, or if you have options or whatever. It depends, or happens to be. Or what did you have for dinner last night or for breakfast this morning? Did you think really hard about it? When you go to the grocery store, do you purposefully grab the exact things that you need for different meals, or are you just kind of grabbing some different stuff in a ratio that kind of seems like it makes sense to you? And maybe the most relatable here, when you have some sort of social prospect or professional prospect, like you interview for a job and you are trying to think about how likely it is you're going to get it, you turn in a paper, think about what your grade is going to be, ask somebody out on a date, and think about whether they're going to say yes or it's going to go well. You estimate all kinds of things about that, and you base it on rules of thumb. You base it on estimations. You don't have this information. You have to make some sort of mental shortcut to get to that information. And the way that we make a lot of these decisions or forecasts are by using these mental shortcuts called heuristics. So these are ways that we, over time, learn to make quick and efficient judgments without having to shift too far over to that more conscious mode of processing, without having to engage in deliberative thinking. So like I said earlier, schemas are about cognitive content. Heuristics are an example of cognitive processes. They're using the cognitive content from schemas in a relatively straightforward and consistent way. These rules of thumb for how you apply that information to different situations. And sometimes they are wrong, and or the answers that heuristics lead to are wrong. On average, they're going to be right, or we wouldn't do them. They're adaptive for us to use these quick rules that work most of the time, but they don't work all the time. And in class, I think these work better if we do them live to have you be able to think about them. We'll talk about some different types of heuristics, and that will give you some ideas about how they work, how you can try not to fall prey to them sometimes. And I say fall prey again. They work on average, or we would not have adapted to use them, right? They would not be part of our mental toolkit. But there are ways you can, ask questions that make it likely that these heuristics are going to lead to mistakes, we'll say. Okay. I've talked a bit, obviously, about more automatic and more controlled processing. I've talked about how when we engage in more automatic processing, we might be more likely to make certain types of mistakes. So frequently people, would want to make better judgments and not make so many errors. So they would want to engage in more conscious, deliberative, effortful, explicit types of thinking, which we might call system 2 thinking, systematic processing, something like that. So how can we do that? When and how do people use controlled processing as opposed to automatic processing? The big things that I've already alluded to a bit are whether you have the ability and the motivation to shift further to controlled processing from automatic processing. And ability is the resources to be able to do something. Motivation is the drive to do something. And I'm going to go through some examples of each of these, but they both can be internal or external. You can have things that affect your ability inside yourself and outside of yourself. You can have motivations that are internal, directed by your own desires, and things that are kind of imposed upon you as well. So things that impact ability, again, these are just a few examples. These are obviously not an exhaustive list of things that impact ability, but your personal cognitive ability, like your intelligence, your working memory processing capacity, if you are more intelligent, generally more educated, going to have better working memory processing, any of those things, then you might be better at engaging in conscious processing. That would be like an internal thing that is going to impact your ability generally to engage in conscious processing. Some external things might be like being under time pressure or being distracted. So if you're having to do something very quickly, then that's rarely going to let you engage in conscious, effortful processing or deliberation. Similarly, if you're distracted by something, if your attention is divided, if you can't put all your mental resources towards something because you're, stressed about something, or someone has interrupted you, or you have to try to do things at once, you're generally not going to be very good at shifting toward controlled processing. And we have some sort of analogous things for motivation. There are internal and external things that can impact your motivation. One general internal thing would be a type of cognitive style variable that is kind of akin to a personality trait in a way. You can measure it very similarly. There's a distribution of people from high to low in need for cognition, and many people in the middle. But this is basically, how much do you like mentally effortful activities? Some people just like to do things like puzzles, or try to figure out things logically and do stuff like that more than other people. Those people would be high in need for cognition. That's going to lead you to be more motivated overall to engage in controlled compared to automatic processing. Some external things that might impact motivation are, if you are responsible for some sort of outcome, if it reflects on you, like if you are leading a project or you are a manager of some sort, then you are going to be more accountable, more responsible for the types of outcomes that happen. You're going to want to think about it more carefully. Or if something is personally relevant for you, a very classic example of this is a way of manipulating the way people think about tuition increases. So imagine you are a senior in college, and you're told that your school is thinking about increasing tuition. Actually, let's put it this way. Imagine you're a junior in college, and your school is thinking about increasing tuition. If you're told that they're going to have that tuition increase next year, your senior year, you're going to have a different level of personal relevance than if they say this increase is going to happen in 5 years, right? So if it is going to affect you next year, you're more likely to think more carefully about it than if you think it's going to affect people that are, in school after you're gone, right? The personal relevance is different, and the more relevant something is, the more motivation you have to shift and think about something more carefully. And then just generally, if a task is more important, deciding what jobs to apply for is generally going to lead to more engagement and care than deciding like whether you should get 1 or 2 boxes of cereal that you like or something, right? If a task or a decision is very important, it's going to require more of that motivation, or it's going to be more motivating for you to think carefully about it. Okay, last video, I'm going to wrap up just a little bit about conscious processing, then we'll talk a bit about language.